Welcome to Philosophy 2 Logic. I will be your instructor. My name is Ryan, Dr. Ryan Sherbart, and I want to start this course with a logic puzzle as an introduction to the material. So I pulled this off the web recently. This is a logic puzzle called the intelligence test, the intelligence trap test, but it's really a quick test in your reasoning ability, which is one of the things that we are going to cover in great detail in this course. So here's the puzzle. Imagine three people, one named Jack, one named Anne, and one named George. Jack is looking at Anne and is looking at nothing else. Anne is looking at George and nothing else. And George, the third person, has their eyes closed or isn't looking at anything. So Jack is looking at Anne at George, and George at no one, nothing. Further, we know that Jack, the first person, is married. And George, the third person, is not, is unmarried. Now, here's the question. From that information alone, can we reason out, can we deduce whether or not a married person, sorry about that, a married person is looking at an unmarried person? Yes, no, or cannot be determined. So chew on that for a little bit. I'll go over the answer later in the video. But let's move on to a second logic puzzle. And then what we'll do is talk about what logic is in general, talk about where it sits in relation to other areas in philosophy. This is a philosophy course. We'll talk about what philosophy is in general and how it's similar but different to science and religion. So this is our second warm-up logic puzzle of the lecture, of the course, really. And this one, I'll go over the puzzle and the answer right away. And then later, we'll go over the answer to this one. So keep mulling this one over. So here's a little second logic puzzle. So there's a baseball bat and there's a baseball. And together, they cost $1.10. So you have a baseball, you have a bat. Further, we know that the bat is $1 more than the baseball. The bat is $1 more than the baseball. Question: how much is the baseball? How much does the ball cost? So you can pause the video and think about that for a second. Now, if I had you answer right away, if you just blurted out your first guess, a lot of people say, oh, this is easy. The bat is $1 and the ball is a dime. The bat is $1 and the ball is 10 cents. And you add that up and you get $1.10. There you go. That's the answer. But if you ruminate on that for a little bit, you'll realize that that doesn't make sense, because we said the difference between the two is $1, but the difference between a bat that's $1 and a ball that's a dime isn't $1, it's 90 cents, right? 10 cents from $1 is 90 cents. So that answer isn't right. So if you think about it further, you can logic out, reason out, deduce the correct answer, which is that the bat, of course, is $1.05, and the ball is a nickel. When you add those two together, you also get $1.10, right? $1.05 plus 5 cents, $1.10. And then when you do the subtraction, when you take a nickel away from $1.05, when you reduce that $1.05 down 5 cents, you're at $1. And that's the difference between the two. And the bat costs $1 more than the ball. So that's the right answer. So how did those of us who got it right the first time get at that answer? Well, you might have expressed this algebraically. That would be one way to do it. That'd be perfectly fine. You might have just thought it through and did maybe trial and error, guess and check. But the ability that you use is this perhaps to a certain extent innate ability, or to a certain extent learned ability to reason well, to think rationally, to think logically. And those of us who didn't get the answer right the first time, and if that's you, that's probably the majority of people. And by the way, the first time I was presented with this puzzle, I immediately jumped to the $1.10 answer. So don't feel bad. But then when someone explains to you that that's incorrect and they present you with the correct answer, how is it that the light bulb goes off in all of our minds and how are we able to see the error of our ways, the error of our thinking? Well, again, it's because of this ability, this perhaps circuitry of the mind to reason correctly and properly. And it's not an ability that is infallible. It is not perfect. We are not logic machines. We make mistakes, but it has helped us as a species do quite well and do amazing things. So that's part of what this course is all about. We're going to study logic, and we're going to hone and sharpen this ability that everyone has to a certain extent. So as you can see here, logic is a major area of philosophy. Logic is also studied in other disciplines. So in mathematics, there is a subfield that studies logic. And some might argue that the foundations of mathematics are logical axioms, and that might be the case. And you can even see in this baseball puzzle that there's this math element to it. So there certainly is overlap between the fields. Logic is the study of reasoning, the study of correct reasoning. It's the study of argumentation. Arguments are really important to philosophers. It's how we make progress in our field. The ancient Greeks, thinkers like Socrates and Aristotle and Plato, they said that philosophy begins with wonder. So we observe the world, or we self-reflect about ourselves and our minds and other people and relationships. And we ask these deep, profound, interesting questions. We wonder about things, and questions arise, and then we attempt to answer these questions. But answering the question, in a sense, is the easy part. So take, for example, a question about one of these issues, the existence of God or the existence of free will. Well, you could say yes or no to both. So if you're a believer, you would say, oh, yeah, God exists. Or if you're an atheist, you'd say, no, I don't think so. Free will. You ask people on the street, they would say, yeah, I have maybe not control over everything that I do, but a lot of the things I do is my choice. Certainly like wiggling a finger or moving a limb, it would seem like we are the ones that are authoring those actions. We're in charge. We freely decided to do this versus that. So it exists. So that's the answer to the question, but that's sort of the easy part. The hard part, which is the rest of the argument, is coming up with at least one reason for why the conclusion should be accepted. So, or the answer to the question should be accepted. So if you say God exists, or you say there's free will, there's no God, or there's no free will, you got to say why you think that. And when you give that reason or set of reasons or that evidence, then you are providing an argument. So an argument for our course is going to have two very important parts. It's going to have a conclusion, and in the examples I gave, the answer to the question that, to some philosophical question about, say, free will or God or justice or beauty or the mind. Yes, there is free will, or, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's a saying that people have put forward. Those are potential conclusions. But an argument is incomplete unless, in addition to a conclusion, we also have premises. And the idea is the premises act as support for the conclusion. We'll get more into that later in the course, but since it is important to the heart of logic, the heart of progress in philosophy, the study of argumentation, we are going to learn a systematic way to determine whether or not an argument is good or not. We are going to learn about a concept called validity. We're going to be on the hunt for something called valid arguments. So we'll say a lot more about what that is and what that means. Before we go further into, the rest of the course, which will be dedicated to logic, I want to talk a bit about some of the other major areas of philosophy, because I want you to have some handle, some grip on what philosophy is in general. Since this is a philosophy class, it's a good idea to know precisely what philosophy is. And I think one of the best ways to answer that question is to talk about some of these major areas that are so important to philosophers, especially academic philosophers. So logic is a major area. Another one is ethics, which is sometimes called moral philosophy. So ethics is the philosophical study of rightness and wrongness, what's morally correct and incorrect. Morality looks at specific things, like if I were in some ethical dilemma, what is the proper course of action? And moral philosophy also investigates very theoretical general things, like what is justice in the most profound, deepest sense? Do people have rights? Are they innate? Are they merely guaranteed to us by the state or the government? Moral philosophers also sometimes hunt for what they call moral principles that can guide our ethical behavior. Metaphysics is another major area in academic philosophy. And you might think of astrology or extrasensory perception studies or witchcraft, things of that matter. And that is perhaps a more common meaning of metaphysics, but philosophers use the term differently. For philosophers, metaphysics is the philosophical study of reality, of being, of existence. And two very important questions in metaphysics are, one, does the thing in question exist? Is it real? Does it have being? So does God exist? That's a metaphysical question, does free will exist? Metaphysical question, is God real? Does God have being? Does God exist? Is free will real? Does it exist? This study of being is sometimes called ontology. Ontology, the study of being. And a second very important question in metaphysics is, assuming the thing in question exists, what is it like? What is its nature? Does it have any essential features? So if let's say an atheist is having a debate with a theist, someone who is a believer in the existence of God, the atheist might say, you know what, for the sake of argument, I will grant to you that God is real. And if I grant you that, here's my follow-up question. What is God's nature? What is God like? Does God have any essential features? So that's asking the second major metaphysical question. And many believers in the West will often give character traits of God. So these are perhaps not, this isn't necessarily a comprehensive list of all of the essential features of God, but these are three qualities or character traits, characteristics that you find in a lot of followers of major Western traditions, whether it be Christianity, Judaism, Islam. And those character traits are the following. God is claimed to be all-knowing, omniscient. In other words, God is said to be all-powerful, omnipotent, in other words, and God is all-loving or wholly good, omnibenevolent. So if you've heard of benevolence, put the omni in front of it and you get something that means all good. So all-knowing, all-powerful, all good. So we just did a little bit of metaphysics in the philosophy of religion, which is one of the subfields of metaphysics. And fourth, epistemology, another huge area in academic philosophy. Epistemology is the philosophical study of knowledge. And just like there are important questions in metaphysics, there are important questions in epistemology, including the following three questions that I will go through now. The first is knowledge. What is it? Knowledge as a concept. How do we analyze it? What exactly is knowledge? It seems to have something to do with belief, but knowledge and belief aren't synonyms. They're not the same thing. There are some things that I believe that I know, but many people believe things that are false or incorrect. So for example, thousands of years ago, human beings, it was widely believed that the earth was flat. So at the time, those people believed that, but did they know that the earth was flat? I don't think we want to say that. So we need something more. And philosophers, epistemologists, people who study knowledge, they will often point to other criteria for knowledge in addition to belief. And that criteria includes justification and truth, perhaps. So that's a classic definition of knowledge as justified true belief. So that addresses one of the major questions of epistemology, knowledge. What is it? Another big question, I said there were three, here's the second one. Knowledge, do we have it? So we believe all sorts of things, but how many of those beliefs of ours count as knowledge? For instance, I have many beliefs. I believe my name is Ryan. I believe I was born in California. I believe I still live in California. I believe I'm a citizen of the United States. And I don't just want to say that I believe these things. I want to say that further, I know these things. I know my name. I know where I was born. I know where I live. I know where I have citizenship. Now, is there a limit to knowledge? And can I be mistaken about my things I think I know, but in the end, I'm incorrect? It seems like I have to admit the possibility of being wrong. But how deep does this skepticism go? Everyone is skeptical about some things. So, for instance, if you were to tell me that the earth is flat, I would find that dubious. I would be skeptical of that claim. If you were to tell me that I wasn't born in California, I would be skeptical of that. If you were to tell me that the tooth fairy that children are often told about when they're young is actually real, and that as adults we should continue to believe, I would be skeptical about that assertion. And you might say that the skepticism of mine is a healthy amount or degree of skepticism, and that it's important to be skeptical, at least to some degree, because if you weren't, then you would just be gullible and you would accept everything, and that can be quite dangerous. So we need some skepticism, but can we take it too far? And the answer seems to be yes. What if we were to endorse some form of global skepticism, a radical amount of skepticism? This is something that a famous French philosopher from the 17th century was gravely concerned about. His name was Rene Descartes. And if you've ever heard the saying or the phrase, I think, therefore I am, that's attributed to Descartes. And he used that argument to combat radical skepticism. If you have ever watched or read any of those stories or movies or TV shows that delve into this radical skepticism, then you have some sense of what I'm talking about. So if you've heard people talk about the simulation hypothesis, or if you've seen any of the Matrix movies, those play around with the idea of a radical type of skepticism where pretty much everything that we think we know ends up being false or incorrect. So if I'm like the Neo character in the Matrix, then these beliefs I have about my name and where I was born and where I live, they're all just part of a big matrix, a computer simulation, and I don't have knowledge of those things. Descartes wrote about life being one long dream. I saw some internet meme going around that is a version of Descartes' worry about, life being one big dream, this dream hypothesis. And it goes something like this. Imagine that in a moment you feel a tap on your shoulder, and all of a sudden you wake up and you're in 7th grade, and it's like your math teacher just said, "Hey, wake up." And your whole life from 7th grade until now has just been one super long, super realistic daydream. Now, that makes you go kind of like, whoa, that seems unlikely. But it's very difficult to decidedly rule that out. Turns out it's really, really hard to do that. So that's work in epistemology. The third major question is knowledge. How do we get it? How do we acquire it? And people who are interested in studying science are often doing epistemology because science seems to be one of our best avenues or pathways to accumulating knowledge, objective knowledge, if there is such a thing. So that's epistemology. Okay, we've given you an introduction to what philosophy is by going through some of these very important major branches or areas of philosophy. And just as a side note, the way that this breakdown here of philosophy into areas, it's a bit of a personal preference. There's lots of ways to describe philosophy or to carve it up. And some people have a preference to explain philosophy historically. So perhaps more traditionally, if you were to take like an intro to philosophy class, it would really be a history of philosophy class. And you would start with the very beginning of philosophy or Western philosophy, and that might be the ancient Greeks or the pre-Socratics. And then after the ancient Greeks, you would go into other classical philosophers of antiquity, Roman philosophers and the Stoics, and then medieval philosophers, and then modern philosophers, postmodern philosophers, contemporary era. So that's another powerful way to learn about philosophy, to investigate it, is to look at it through the lens of history and taking into account major events in history that informed and influenced the philosophy of the day. So I just wanted to say that. Now, okay, we've talked about these areas, we talked about the history of philosophy, but what is it in general? What is it in brief? If you were to, in a sentence, say what philosophy is, well, it turns out to be quite difficult, but let's give it a shot. For a class, we'll say that philosophy is an important kind of thinking. It turns out that it is much more of something that you do. It's much more of an activity than it is a set of beliefs or set of knowledge or a worldview. It's something that you do. It's active. It's not passive. And it's not just mundane, trivial, everyday kind of thinking. It's profound, deep, critical thinking that is systematic and careful and meticulous and creative and innovative. And the subject of the thinking, again, isn't the mundane, the trivial, the everyday. It's thinking about questions that are pervasive, that are important, that may seem to have a simple answer at first, but the more that you investigate them, the more complicated the matter seems to get. So, for instance, time. So you might say, what is time? And then, that seems like an everyday question. And well, when you try to answer it, you might say, well, time is what is measured by clocks. And you go like, well, what do clocks measure? Time. Well, you can't just do that because that's a circular definition. There was a famous philosopher who said that time is one of those things that everyone knows what it is. We can properly use the word meaningfully. When we use it publicly, we understand each other. And yet, when we're pressed to define it with precision, it seems impossible, or we invariably fall short. So that's an example of a philosophical question, the philosophy of time, which would be in metaphysics, by the way, the nature and reality of time. Okay, so we're going to wrap up this video lecture by explaining what philosophy is by contrast and by similarity, because there are two other academic domains where there's similarity but important differences to philosophy, and that is science and religion. So what science, philosophy, and religion all have in common is that all three disciplines are after the truth in some sense. All three are trying to figure out the way it is. They're trying to acquire knowledge, maybe as well. But how are they different? Well, philosophy and science are different in the purview, if you will, of the area of inquiry. So the natural world, the empirical world, the observable world, that's where science reigns supreme. Philosophers ask questions and write about things in the natural world, but our best tool to investigate the natural world, at least as of now in our present spot in history, is science. So to explain what I mean by different purviews or different reaches of scientists and philosophers, compare these two sets of questions, two kinds of questions. One I will call empirical, scientific questions, if you will, and the other we'll call philosophical. So if you were familiar with the Jurassic Park franchise, in that movie, the scientists, the geneticists and the archaeologists and the bioengineers, they figure out how to answer this question. How do you clone a Tyrannosaurus Rex? How do you bring back a dinosaur that has been extinct for tens of millions of years? That question is one that science, it's really only science can, well, I have to be careful with that. Science is very well suited to answer. Let's put it that way. To answer this question, you have to engage in the scientific method. You have to perhaps start with observations and then form a hypothesis and then put that hypothesis to the test. You have to do experiments. And then you have to see if your hypothesis is confirmed or disconfirmed. And then you have to tweak your hypothesis if it turns out that it's disconfirmed. And if it's confirmed, then you have to go through the process again because you want the results to be repeatable. You have to bounce your finding off of other scientists. What does the scientific community say about this? So that's all under the purview of the empirical. So empirical questions are questions that can be answered by using the scientific method. That's how we'll define empirical questions. Philosophical questions are those that really go beyond the empirical. There are questions that the scientific method really remains silent on or agnostic. So compare the how do you clone a T-Rex question to this question that's similar but different. Is it morally acceptable to clone a T-Rex? Is this a good idea? Not just asking like, is it legally good or legal, but is this good in a deeper sense? Is this good for us, for humanity, for the world? Does this make the world a better place? Questions like that. The scientific method doesn't tell you about moral rightness and wrongness. To answer that question, you need to think philosophically. You need to engage with this area of philosophy, ethics or moral philosophy. So let me put it one more way. Science can tell you how the world is, but it doesn't so much tell you how the world ought to be, morally speaking. Same thing for this question. How do you engineer a self-driving car? Well, that question is best answered by scientists in those related fields, whether it be computer science or computer engineering. If you could kind of sit in a comfy chair near a fire and kind of close your eyes and just reflect critically and creatively, the answer is probably not going to come to you. You need to do this. You need to engage with the scientific method. But even the best computer engineers in the world they won't be able to answer this question unless they start thinking philosophically, which scientists can do both. Um, it's just academic philosophers have been specializing in this type of thinking and argumentation for decades, for the bulk of their professional career. And so it's not that philosophy professors are the only ones who can answer these questions. No, that's what is, I personally love about this discipline is it's something that's available to everyone. You don't need a certain background in mathematics or chemistry or physics or a certain graduate degree to at least begin to tackle these questions. You can do it just as an ordinary person. And that's something that drew me to philosophy in the first place, is it's something that anyone with a good head on their shoulders can do. And these philosophical questions that haven't been fully answered, even after 2,000, 2,500 years of trying to answer them, I love the idea that me, you, some person on the other side of the world, they could come up with a breakthrough, and they don't need necessarily any special training. The training, of course, helps, but there's really the only requisite you need. You don't need a laboratory. You don't need a team of scientists. You don't need a research grant per se. You don't need giant buildings and measurement devices and telescopes and test tubes. All you need is a good head on your shoulders. You just need to be an open-minded, critical, creative thinker. And there's something just really cool about that. I mean, I'm biased, obviously, but I hope you're getting the point. So the scientists, they can't really answer this question unless they engage with the philosophical method. What's the morally best way to program a self-driving car? So, for instance, let's say that the people that are programming the software of these self-driving cars, they realize that they need an emergency plan, say if the brakes fail in the car. What is the car supposed to do? And maybe the engineers, the emergency course of action is the car will swerve, right? Because if the car needs to brake and it can't, it wants to brake because there's something it's braking for, then it'll swerve, because if it goes straight, there could be problems. So, but let's complicate the matter. This is what philosophers love to do. They love to come up with these hypothetical cases, and then they tweak them, making them even more challenging with every tweak. So suppose that a self-driving car is approaching a crosswalk, and there are 5 pedestrians in the crosswalk, and the brakes fail on the car. No problem, said the engineers. The car will swerve so that won't hit the pedestrians. Okay, but here's the tweak. Let's say no matter which way the car swerves, the car will crash and kill the passenger in the self-driving car. Like if it swerves to the right, maybe it crashes into a tree. If it swerves to the left, maybe it goes off an embankment or, down a cliff or something. So it's like, pick your poison. What's the lesser of two evils? Does the car quickly calculate, well, how many pedestrians, how many people are in the car? And then it's just a numbers game. You can see that if the computer scientists are saying, I can program it any way you want. I could say, swerve, it could be like a logic circuit, like with kind of if then. So if people in crosswalk outnumber passengers in car, then do X, just swerve. But we have to, as people, we have to decide what should be programmed into the car. What should that formula be? And science doesn't give you that formula. The only way to come up with that formula is to engage with this process. And you can go through the rest of these questions kind of on your own. You can start to see the pattern that the ones over here, science is really well suited to answer, philosophy not so much. The questions on the right, science doesn't really tell you an answer. You can do science until you're blue in the face, and you probably won't be able to answer these. And that's what makes them go beyond the empirical. That's what makes them philosophical. So that's the similarity and difference between philosophy and science. They're both after truth and knowledge, but knowledge and truth that goes beyond the natural domain, the empirical domain, that's where philosophy is better suited to tackle those issues. The natural world, science reigns supreme. Okay, and finally, we'll end this lecture by talking about philosophy versus religion. So again, the similarity, it's the same. Both of these are after truth, profound truths. And religion isn't particularly focused on empirical truths like science. Religion is interested in truths that are similar to the ones that philosophers are trying to pursue. So philosophers want to know about free will and God and justice and moral rightness and wrongness. And you can find answers to those questions in religion or theology or religious studies. Like, what is justice? Well, it's whatever the divine commands of God are. Do we have free will? Religion might say, yes, it's a gift to us from God. Does God exist? Yes. Here's the proof. Here's this book that was authored by God. So science doesn't really give us answers to those sorts of questions, but religion does. So maybe we don't need philosophy. Maybe let's just use religion. Religion is older than philosophy in a sense. One of probably the world's oldest living religion that is widely practiced is Hinduism. And Hinduism is, like over 4,500 years old. And at least philosophy in the Western tradition, it's like 2,500 years old. And archaeologists who have found fossil records of human beings from tens of thousands of years ago, 100,000 of years ago, perhaps, maybe not that far, but maybe they found human bones that were buried in the fetal position. And that suggested to the anthropologists and archaeologists that there might have been some religious practices or beliefs, because that, we don't know exactly what they're thinking, but that suggests, at least to a certain extent, that there might have been some sort of belief in an afterlife or like a rebirth. The fetal position is the position we are in, as fetuses, or at the very, or right at the time of pregnancy, like this, like an infant in there essentially. And so you're born like this in the fetal position, and maybe in death, it's perhaps putting the corpse in that fetal position again. It's positioning them literally for a rebirth. So why not? Let's go with the thing that's been around longer. It's got a longer track record. Well, here's a major difference between the two. And, this class isn't about rank ordering these things or promoting one over the other, or downplaying one. There's no agenda there's no agenda like that. That's what's kind of cool about this class, is we get to play around with these big ideas. But this class, it's not so much about conclusions. In this class, logic is special. I guess I should tell you that what makes logic special is that it's different than the other three major areas here because it's really the vehicle, the toolkit that philosophers use to make progress in our discipline. The way that philosophers often make progress is by, writing their ideas down, their thoughts down, and they often come in the form of very complex arguments. And the merit of the argument will be based on how strong the logic is. And so if you're going to make advances in metaphysics or ethics, then you need to present your ideas. And often those ideas contain these powerful arguments, that they have these ethical, metaphysical, epistemological conclusions. And why should we accept them? Well, because the power of the premises are so strong, that they're true and they have this support for the conclusion. Sometimes we'll talk about following or entailing. The conclusion follows from the evidence or from the premises. We'll talk a lot about that. Yeah. So what's kind of nice about logic is it's refreshing. So if you've taken other philosophy courses, it's less about a final answer, a correct answer, and it's more about the process, and it's more about exercising a type of thinking that will be helpful for you for the rest of your life. And there's data to support this. So if you look at how philosophy majors do in their jobs and their careers after they graduate, they do great. You compare them, to other majors. It's not that they're, at the top. It depends on what you mean by great, right? You could look at salaries, for example, and of course, there's very, very lucrative majors that a lot of us know about. I'm sure, some of your parents might encourage you, say, oh, go into medicine or go into law, because we know that these tend to be very lucrative careers. If there's, I don't want to, I would never step on really any major, just as, this is, I'm biased, but I have so much respect for my colleagues in all disciplines, and I see the merit and value of all of them. But philosophy sometimes gets a bad rap because people worry about what's the real world application of it. Even politicians, there's some sound bites of politicians saying like, the world needs more plumbers, not more philosophers. And you can kind of get what they're saying is that, what can you do directly with the philosophy degree? And, outside of doing something like this, teaching philosophy, it's true that directly, maybe the career options aren't as plentiful as other disciplines. Although, to be fair, if you do some research into some of the companies in this area, like the tech companies, they're actually hiring philosophers to help, so like the self-driving car problem. Oops, we can show you this too. This is a headline from not that long ago, you can see. And this might be in our future, the Tesla bot. So if you don't want to go to the grocery store anymore or, pick up things around the house, that's okay. You can have a Tesla bot and it will make your life easier and you can focus on doing more important things in your life. Now, this is frightening to a lot of people because it makes us think of, I don't know, about 1 billion science fiction movies and books where we make these sorts of robots or androids and they turn on us and they go evil and they end up like taking over the human race. We mentioned the Matrix, and of course like Terminator or iRobot, and there's a bunch of other ones. So companies like Tesla, they're actually hiring, PhDs or masters or people with bachelors in philosophy to help them design these things in a prudent and ethical way. Okay, back to philosophy and religion. They're both after truth, and they both give us answers to truths and issues, questions that go beyond the empirical. However, here's the big difference is the starting points and the assumptions. So for many religions, the starting point is some central text or book. For Christians, of course, it's the Bible. For Jews, it's the Torah. For Muslims, it's the Quran. For Buddhists, it's the sutras or teachings of the Buddha. For Taoists, it's the Tao Te Ching. So if you want knowledge, if you want truth, then you find it in those sacred texts, in that scripture. And that might be considered religious dogma. So dogma sometimes is used pejoratively, but I don't mean it in that sense. By religious dogma, I mean, assumptions, starting points, truths, beliefs that you don't really question. That's what I mean by religious dogma. So some of the fundamental starting points of religion, that Jesus is God for Christians. That's a fundamental starting point. So if you reject that, then it's you're like not even on the same page as the religion. You're just okay. Well, if you told a Christian that, they might say, "Oh, okay, well, then I think by definition that means that you're not a Christian." They might be, maybe they're very tolerant, open person. They might say, which is fine. But in philosophy, it's pretty much always okay to question any and all assumptions. There might be some basic assumptions, maybe in logic, maybe some basic axioms of logic, like a rule about contradictions, so any argument or any philosophical idea, it has to be logically consistent. It cannot be logically incoherent. That would just be madness. That would just be the pinnacle of irrationality. But then you might even be able to question that one. But other than that, it's pretty much fair game. So there's no axioms, there's no dogma, there's no starting point from which all other truths are derived. And so the assumptions that you find in religion, those what I call starting points, those aren't there in philosophy. So in theology, religious studies, and specific religions, the way that they pursue truth is through revelation, is through sacred scripture. It also might be through clergy people who have studied the scripture, so you can find it in the book itself, but you might also find it by talking to someone who is an expert in that religion. So that could be a priest, a pastor, a rabbi, an imam, a monk, etc., a nun, the pope, the Dalai Lama, some reincarnation of the Buddha, whatever it is, or just someone who went to seminary school or went to rabbinical school. You can learn from them. In philosophy, the way that you get at truth, it's not through dogma and religious assumptions. It is through what this class is going to focus on: logic and argumentation and reason and conceptual analysis, and being sharp and critical and skeptical to the right degree, and also dialoguing with philosophers and non-philosophers alike. So scientists put their ideas to the test by showing their work to other scientists and seeing if the other scientists get the same results when, like let's say it's lab work or some experiment. When they recreate the experiment independently, do they get the same results? So that's one of the ways that you make progress in science. In philosophy, you also bounce your ideas off of other scholars in your field. You say, hey, I got this idea about free will or about knowledge or about justice. And then another philosopher says, oh, okay, great, let me see. And then, you might read it, or maybe they might present it publicly, at a conference. And everyone listens. A lot of times there's a philosophy talk and they will give their lecture for like 40 minutes and then they do 20 minutes of question and answering. And then the philosopher will go to another university and give the same talk. And they, the point isn't to, it's not to exchange the harshest of criticisms. It's to charitably and generously do an intellectual exchange where the author of the idea, it's hard for them to step out of their shoes and see their own ideas with fresh eyes. And so that's why it's good to bounce it off other people. Think about the essays and papers that you've had to write so far in your life. If you do it just by yourself, which a lot of times we often do, they can be good, maybe great, but the best of papers and essays and the things that get published, they're always sent to many other eyes and readers and editors and people that help you revise. And that's that kind of teamwork that makes for progress and the best kind of work. All right. That's the introduction to logic. That's the introduction to philosophy. I hope you enjoyed that. I'll see you next time.